Again, I want to thank you all for, and Brownie, you're doing a heck of a job. The FEMA director's working 24.
Joining me today is the former director of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, better known as FEMA, as well as the host of the Michael Brown radio show. Michael Brown, welcome to the Rubin Report.
Hey Dave, good to see you.
Good to be with you.
Thanks.
You know, this is the first time we've ever done this where we played a 10-second clip.
Let me guess.
Do you have any idea what
I can't even imagine what you might be talking about.
Yes. I struggled with it for a little while because I thought, do I want to go right in and throw this right at him, sort of the infamous moment, or do we want to ease into it? But then I thought, let's just get it out.
Get it out there, because it is what it is. It's a seminal moment in my life. There's before that moment and after that moment.
Yeah. All right. There are many, many reasons that I'm glad to be sitting here with you, because I think we're going to get into so many of the things that we talk about on the show all the time about the role of government and the difference between local government and federal government, all of these agencies and red tape and all that, but also that for that moment and what happened for the months and probably years after that, and actually even when I was Googling you this morning, all the 10-year anniversary people that were still pissed at you and all that stuff. It has a lot to do with just sort of the general outrage culture and blame culture and all of that. So we're going to do a lot here. So first, let's just start with that moment, though, and then I want to do everything else backwards.
Sure.
Okay, just tell me a little bit about the days leading up to Hurricane Katrina.
It became clear to me probably it came clear to me the day after the storm made landfall, because I was on a Black Hawk helicopter with former Senator Mary Landrieu, and we were supposed to be going straight to the Superdome to meet with Mayor Nagin, who I always like to joke remind people he's still in federal prison. And I'm sitting there, and I'm just kind of reading my notes from my staff, and I look out the helicopter and I realize that we're going the wrong direction across Lake Pontchartrain. And I asked the pilot, where are you going? And he said, well, the senator has asked that we go check her cabin before we go to the Superdome. I was livid. So now I have a sitting United States Senator next to me who's just overridden what I said we need to be doing and what the priorities are. I have the governor sitting next to her who doesn't have the wherewithal to say to the senator, you know what, your cabin is not our priority. The priority is the people of New Orleans. It was at that moment that I realized that I had walked into a state that was so much more corrupt. I've been involved in politics since I was literally 6 years old. That it was just so corrupt and it was so dysfunctional that I knew that everything that I had in my head about how things should operate were going to start going out the window.
Okay, I think that's actually a perfect story to now start with your childhood. Let's just get a little bio out of you, because I think that's really interesting, and what led you to eventually be the director of FEMA, and then we'll go through everything else. So just tell me a little bit about growing up. Was your family political? What sort of got you into this world?
Well, my family was kind of political when I think about it. I mean, my mom is 86, 87 years old, and she still works for the election board. She still does the little local elections in the little town that I grew up in.
I think you have to be over 80 to work at the election board.
Exactly. I think it is a requirement. She's been doing it since she was in high school. But when the first Republican governor of Oklahoma was running, he was the state party chairman, a guy by the name of Henry Bellman, was coming out to the Oklahoma Panhandle. And they recruited me at 6 years old to be the little kid to hand the push cards out as he walked these rural streets of Oklahoma. So I just grew up in this political family that was always involved. And of course, involved in student council and, in college and Young Republicans and all of that. And so politics has just always been a part of my life.
Yeah.
And I always thought I understood politics until I got to Washington, D.C. and until Hurricane Katrina. And it just gave me an entirely different perspective.
Yeah.
But anyway, long story short, I took the typical route, graduated from high school, and my wife is my childhood sweetheart. Her dad actually delivered me.
Wow.
That's the kind of small town we grew up in.
Wow.
We've been married for, 40-some years. I don't want to say how many. And, went to law school, raised 2 children, very successful, very, very successful children, and just had a pretty normal life, except that I knew I wanted to be a lawyer, but I always had this thought process that you never turn down, you always look at an opportunity. And if an opportunity looks good, you take that opportunity, even if it's off the path you thought you were going to take. And so that's led me to these incredible experiences in my life that most people don't do because they become lawyers and all they do is practice law their entire life.
Yeah,
That's not me.
So what was the first one of those moments when you thought, wow, there's a good opportunity a little to the right, off that exit?
The Oklahoma Republican Party came to me and asked me to run for Congress back in 1988, promised me all of this money that they were going to, in fact, that governor, who was the first Republican governor, went on to be a U.S. Senator and then came back. He was a big supporter of me, but I was running.
That?
Henry Bellman.
Okay.
Yeah, former U.S. Senator. He was involved in the Panama Canal treaties and everything, but the Oklahoma Republican Party recruited me and said, come on, we really want you to run. And so I let ego get in the way, and I ran against a 12-term Democrat incumbent in a gerrymandered district where I got my butt beat. But it was an experience that, again, most Americans never do. Most Americans never throw their hat in the ring and actually go out and say, I'm going to do it. And I would encourage people, whether it's a city council, county commissioner, state representative, whatever it is, if you don't like the way things are going, if you're going to bitch about it, I don't want to hear about it unless you're actually involved doing something. Doesn't mean you have to run for office, but you got to be involved.
Yeah, it's so funny after the ringer that you've been through. I guess maybe it's not funny. It's either ironic or perfectly poetic that still is your message as someone that was sort of put up as the poster boy for everything that's wrong with the government.
Dave, let me tell you. It may be poetic, but sorry, I should quit pointing. It's the lawyer in me.
Go ahead.
It is. I could tell you so many stories about how dysfunctional I've been involved. I was a city councilman. I worked at the state legislature as the finance director. Then you go on, I'm the undersecretary of Homeland Security. I have been inside the bowels of the government, and I can tell you how it works, and it is not what most Americans think.
Yeah, and we're going to get to all of that. So the undersecretary of Homeland Security, that is the director of FEMA,
right.
Correct? That's
right.
just sort of the more technical term for that. Were you involved in the administration before 9/11, or was it after
Yes.
that's when Bush pegged you for this?
No, I was there.
Yeah.
And in fact, I was in Montana getting ready to deliver a speech to the National Emergency Managers Association about the role of FEMA in terrorism on 9/11, 2001.
So you were the director of FEMA at that time?
I was the general counsel at that time.
Okay.
And we ended up on a C-135 going back to Andrews Air Force Base. Joe Albaugh, who was the director at the time, immediately went to ground zero on that Wednesday morning, and I went to the White House and just spent the next, seems like a year, just day in and day out, just planning, getting ready for we didn't know what.
Yeah. What's the one thing that really sticks out in your mind about that day itself?
For the first time, you're flying alone. There are no planes in the sky. You're flying alone. Some airman asked me if I want to go down in the tanker bay and just watch as we fly across, middle America. And I'm listening on the headset, and the only chatter you hear are among the fighter jets that are flying around the country. And when I landed, it was not knowing. It was like there was this blank wall in front of us. None of us knew what was going to happen next. And so we meet in the Roosevelt room and the Situation room that next morning to get briefing by the CIA and everybody else. And I remember just this quietness in the room that everybody knew that none of us knew what we were facing.
Yeah. Was there a feeling that George W. Bush was the right guy to handle this? Because for all the frustrations that people may have with him, and that perhaps you have related to some things with Katrina, and we can get into that.
Right.
I do remember at the time, and I lived in New York City at the time, so I was there for 9/11. My family was there, my grandma was there, my dad. I do remember that between George W. Bush at the time, but particularly Giuliani, I think there was at least a feeling that these guys are sort of the right people to be handling this at the time. Certainly Giuliani, at least from a New Yorker's perspective. Did you feel that? Did people feel that within the government that Bush was kind of able to handle this or had the right skill set to handle this?
Yes, it was. For me, it was one of the most. I can still remember vividly that day in the Roosevelt room. You've got Colin Powell, you've got Donald Rumsfeld, you've got Condi Rice, you've got Andy Card. So you have all these heavy hitters. And then here's little old me sitting at the table too. And I remember watching, because I'm an observer of people, and I remember watching all of them, and there was none of the usual, because I'd been in these meetings before, and there was none of the usual, hey, how you doing? Everybody was at the table, everybody was reading their briefing, everybody was trying to understand. We know that we always refer to the president as the boss. We know the boss is going to ask some tough questions, and we know we're not going to have answers. And that's indeed what happened. Yeah. You know, we had theories, we had ideas, we had plans, but nobody really knew for certain what was next.
Yeah, and especially in those first few days where we didn't know if another attack was coming or anything else. What was actually the job of FEMA for those first few days?
We're the nation's federal first responder. We coordinate all of, for example, at the Pentagon Ground Zero, our job was to make sure that we had all of the urban search and rescue teams deployed, that we take care of the firefighters, we provide all the equipment, we provide the training, we do all of that stuff. So our job was to clean up Ground Zero. Our job was at the Pentagon to help clean that up. And what was fascinating about it was, normally you go to a disaster, it's not also a crime scene. But in this case, both the Pentagon and in Pennsylvania and obviously in Ground Zero, they were also crime scenes. So we now had to coordinate, talk about federalism. So now we had to coordinate, the federal government, state government, local governments. And on top of that, we had to coordinate with the CIA, the FBI, the NSA, and everybody else who's doing all of the forensic work.
How does that go? I mean, one of the things we talk about here a lot is sort of the unwieldy giant government we have right now, sort of all the middlemen and bureaucrats that get in the way of everything. I mean, how did it really go if that's your job?
Here's what's fascinating. When the government's under pressure like that, everybody does what you have to. My mother-in-law had this saying that drives my wife and I crazy. She's now deceased, but it was, sometimes you just have to do what you have to do. And when a crisis hits of that magnitude, it's all hands on deck. Mm-hmm. And if you need to break the rules, people are willing to break the rules to make things happen. So I would say that in those intense moments, that's probably when the government tends to do the best job, because everybody's trying their hardest to do what's best for the country.
Yeah. So how soon after that did W tap you to be the head of FEMA?
Let's see. So shortly after I became the deputy director, I'd say like just a couple of months later, I went from general counsel to deputy director. Then they announced the creation of the department. Well, there's a story about the creation of DHS. Yeah. So they're going to create DHS. So W appoints me to the transition team. We're one of 5 people putting together the department. And I apologize to the nation for that, because I've got lots of regrets about DHS.
I'm happy to talk about that.
We will. And then soon thereafter, Albaugh left, and that's when I became the undersecretary and the director of FEMA. So probably within, a year.
Yeah, boy, and then and just
it's the mailman story. You start in the mailroom and you work your way up.
Yeah, and only 2 years after that, then the other crisis in your career certainly. So tell me a little bit about your regrets creating the Department of Homeland Security.
Well, here's a backstory first that most people don't know. The administration was opposed to the creation of the department. We thought it was a huge mistake. We're going to create this massive bureaucracy. Why? Things are working the way they're supposed to work. But Congress felt this political desire that you have to be seen doing something. Mm-hmm. So once Congress said, hey, we're going to move forward with legislation, then the White House says, oh my God, now we've got to get in front of this, because we want to control it and mold it in our own view, not Congress's view.
Because in effect, they don't want to get legislation put on his desk that he then has to veto, and then it's like, well, he's against Homeland Security.
Exactly. So our job was
what a great example of how screwed up government is right there.
It is. Yeah. So I'm thrown, me and 4 other guys with Clay Johnson, the president's best friend, college roommate, deputy director of OMB, we're thrown together to create this massive new bureaucracy by taking 22 different cultures, 22 different organizations, and throwing them in together and trying to make it work.
Yeah. What are a couple of those organizations that were thrown in there? I mean, it's everybody, right?
It was Secret Service. What the hell is Secret Service doing in Homeland Security? The Coast Guard. The Coast Guard has this kind of schizophrenic role. They work for Homeland Security, yet they're subjected to the military code of conduct, and they kind of technically work for the Pentagon. So we've got all of the, you've got that, you had ICE, Customs and Border Patrol, Immigration, different grants from Department of Justice, FEMA. Everybody had a different culture. And my objection was, you can't throw different cultures together and really expect them to work, either in the short term or the long term. Every organization, corporate, private, governmental, has a culture. And trying to meld those is one of the most difficult things to do. Look, I love Carly Fiorina, consider her a friend, but they brought Carly in to talk to us about how to do mergers and acquisitions. And I'm thinking, wait a minute. The HP merger and acquisition, that didn't seem to go too well. And you're going to tell us how to do this 22 government agency thing? I mean, that's one objection, Dave. Yeah. Then the second objection was, we got airports were the major concern. And for whatever reason, we wanted to blame the private contractors who have a vested interest in making sure that the airlines are secure, right? Mm-hmm. But that's not good enough. Instead, let's fire all of them and let's create this massive new bureaucracy called the TSA. And I'm like the kid in the back of the classroom that keeps raising his hand and saying, but professor, why? How's that going to work? But there was just this momentum.
What would happen when you said something like that? Because now I think in 2018, if you say something about the TSA, most people agree with you. Like, what an unwieldy, ridiculous operation. Yeah.
The reaction was always, well, we're going to meet your objection by doing Y. And I had been around the block long enough to know that that answer was BS. But when you're the one person out of 5, you're outvoted. So you tend to, there's a great Washington Post story that talks about Brown as the bureaucratic infighter. And I was. And the Post writes it as if that's a bad thing, and I consider it a badge of honor, because I was fighting for just the reality that when you tell me that putting these different agencies together is going to be budget neutral, that's BS. When you tell me you're going to create TSA, but you're going to prevent them from ever being a union, that's BS, because I just know how government metastasizes. Mm-hmm. And so the TSA has turned out to be what I thought it was. The dysfunction within DHS, while it may be minimally better, it's still a dysfunctional organization.
So let's back up for a second, because you mentioned that before this, the security, was it all done by private companies before the TSA? That's almost hard to believe. Was it all done by private?
Yes. The airlines who has the most, now you think about just trying to figure out what's the best way to put a program together. Well, who has the most interest in making certain that their planes are never hijacked or flown into buildings? Oh, the airlines. Why don't we let them decide security? Because what do they have competing interests. Mm-hmm. They want to make sure their planes are secure, their passengers are safe, but that the security operates in the most efficient and effective way. Now you tell me government's going to care about those 3 things? BS.
Yeah, well, it's also so interesting because it's like, what a great way to use competition in the right sense, right. Where it's like this airline that's doing it the right way,
yes.
Where they could go, you know what? Look at our marks on security, so we're charging you $5 more, and a lot of people wouldn't have a problem with it.
Right.
It would be a beautiful thing. I didn't realize that it was fully private before that.
Yes.
Wow. So any other? I mean, that's a pretty big issue. But any other big regrets related to?
Yeah. Well, for example, we had within FEMA what was called the Catastrophic Disaster Response Group. Everything has an acronym, so it was the CDRG. And because the FEMA director under federal law, when in times of disaster, reports directly to the president, you're the president's representative. So this CDRG, when there was a disaster like 9/11, we brought all of the cabinet departments and agencies together. So you usually had the deputy secretaries there because they were there on behalf of their bosses. And we would deconflict policy, we would set priorities, and if State Department wanted to do one thing, but DOD wanted to do another, and Ag wanted to do something else. That was where we got all of those deconflicted, because the FEMA director had the authority of the president sitting in that room. Well, that's gone away now, and you've thrown these all together. And I've always said, if you want to find out whether a disaster is being handled properly or not, or any sort of crisis, this could be in the private sector too, ask this question: who's in charge? If you can't answer the question, who's in charge, then it's a cluster.
Is there an inherent sort of, there's a conflict here, which is that basically you're taking government people And for someone like you that maybe wanted less government,
Right.
and I think this is what you're really saying about Bush at the beginning of this,
Yes.
he didn't want this, the administration
Right.
didn't
Right.
want it.
Right.
But government, I mean, this is the problem with libertarians in general.
Yes.
It's like people that want less government, well, if you're in the government, it's hard to look around the office and be like, guys, most of us probably shouldn't even be here. We're going to need new jobs, guys.
So when FEMA first started in 1979, under Jimmy Carter, they had a policy of providing ice to hospitals so that lactating mothers had a place where they could keep milk, where you could keep insulin and other medicines that require, pharmaceuticals that require refrigeration. That ice was for hospitals to provide their local communities a place for the medicines to stay cool and safe and everything else. That has metastasized, which is my favorite word of government. It has metastasized now to where in a disaster we provide every Tom, Dick, and Harry 2 bags of ice so that they can keep their hamburger cold or their Coors beer cold.
Yeah.
And I went to Congress and said, this is out of control. We're spending tens of millions of dollars on ice so that a private citizen can keep their food cold. Is that really a government function? Even talking to conservatives on the Hill, let alone Democrats or liberals or anybody else, I was a heretic because, oh my God, we can't support that because that's taking something away from our constituents. Well, but you realize it's a waste, right? Why should we be doing that? Well, we can't stop it now.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating, and then you just get all these sort of middle management
Right.
bureaucrats in,
Yes.
and man, no
Right.
one's going to give up that power.
Right.
So, was there anything else major for you professionally between 9/11 and Katrina? Like, what were you doing a month before that? Was it still
well,
all
we had the
DHS related and all
yes,
that?
we had the Columbia Space Shuttle disaster, which we had to coordinate with NASA because NASA was in shock, so we had to help them do all the search and rescue from California to Texas. We had huge wildfires in California that were just massive, kind of like they've recently experienced. We had fires throughout the West, flooding in the Midwest. We had the tsunami in Southeast Asia. I mean, I could go on and on and on. Yes, my life was just full of hell from 9/11 on.
So, until the Katrina moment,
Yes.
what was the general feeling about you? Because then now we'll get into this, where you were then used as this.
Well, I was competent, knew what I was doing. The White House always turned to me to get things done. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll take your word. I'll take your word for it. But by and large, you were thought of as a competent executive and
Yes.
everything else. Okay, so
Right.
now FEMA happens. I love the story that you told right at the beginning because what a perfect story of like just awful abuse of power. Go check out my home
Right,
instead of
yes.
the disaster areas and,
Right.
and all that kind of stuff. How does it? There was a certain amount of time we knew that this thing was going to be crazy, right? I mean, how
We
long
knew
did-
before it happened it was going to be
Yeah.
crazy because I had gone to Congress and asked for an appropriation. I actually wanted to spend some tax money to plan for 10 truly catastrophic disasters. Something like a hurricane. You're a former New Yorker. Can you imagine Category 5 going up the Hudson River? Can you imagine something happening to the LNG natural gas port in Boston, a terrorist incident there? Imagine the big one hitting California or the New Madrid Fault. Imagine, because New Orleans is a fishbowl, a Category 5 filling up New Orleans. So Congress had given me money to start doing catastrophic planning for these kinds of things. New Orleans was the first one we picked. And when we did a tabletop exercise to see if we could coordinate the response, the tabletop exercise fell apart, Dave. So I knew probably 9-12 months before Katrina actually occurred that we weren't ready.
So what does that actually mean when you're doing a tabletop exercise? That's just coordinating all the
Yes, you
federal
get all
and
the
local
you get all the
agencies.
players in the room, and you pretend like you're going through a disaster. So what are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing? What are the conflicts? How do we deconflict all these policy issues? Do we have enough food? How do we get DOD to? Does DOD have enough equipment on hand to get in food supplies and everything else? You exercise that around a table, and Louisiana fell apart.
Yeah.
Wouldn't work.
Was it right at the beginning of it that you realized how severe it was?
I've been criticized because in May of 2005, I had my wife.
This is before
Yes,
before
this is
Katrina.
before Katrina.
Yeah.
In May of 2005, several friends of mine, including Colin Powell, had said, you know what, it's probably time to leave. And I asked them seriously, why is it? Well, you've done everything that you can do in terms of trying to mold DHS into what you think it should be, and nothing else is going to happen. It is what it is.
Wow, that's
you
fascinating.
have fought the good fight. You've been here 6 years, and of course my wife was, it's time to go back to Colorado. Let's go back to Colorado. And so I told Andy Card, the White House Chief of Staff, in May of '05 that I wanted to resign and go back to Colorado. And what typically happens, Andy said, can you wait till Labor Day and go through one more hurricane season for us, and that'll give us time to find a replacement? Now, when the president asks you to stay for 5 more months, sure, I can do that.
Man, Labor Day. What was the day that Katrina hit? It was like
August 29th.
August 29th, Labor Day,
Yes.
whatever it is,
Labor Day, yes.
8 days later.
Yes.
Okay, so it hits. I mean, I can remember watching everything on CNN at the time. You mentioned Nagin, who was the
Right,
mayor of the mayor of New Orleans.
New Orleans, right.
How chaotic was it to coordinate? After you said this initial test had failed about a year before.
It was virtually impossible. So I land at the Superdome. The Superdome. Well, let's go back a step.
Yeah.
Before I actually went to New Orleans, before the storm made landfall, Max Mayfield, who was the director of the National Hurricane Center, fellow Okie, he and I got on the phone together, and we knew how bad the storm was going to be, but we could not get the attention of state officials, and frankly, we couldn't get the attention of the DOD and State Department and other people that would be playing a role.
How is that possible? You now had this new DHS that was supposed to be coordinating
Well,
all these
exactly.
wonderful
Well,
things.
because who's in charge? I remember who's in charge.
Yeah.
Well, everybody's now competing for their pecking order because of DHS. So I tell Max Mayfield, would you please explain, because I'm going to have Bushes and Crawford, he'll be on the Civets call, this top secret phone conference, video and everything. And I'll have the mayor, the governor of all the Gulf states there. Jeb will be there for Florida. And I need you to read them the riot act about how bad this is going to be. And he did. And then I pulled out an engineering report that said the New Orleans Superdome cannot even withstand a Category 3 based upon engineering reports. And the mayor just announced that he's going to use the Superdome as a shelter of last resort. I'm screaming on this call, you can't do that, that's a huge mistake, blah, blah, blah.
At this point, what category did they think it was going to be?
We thought it was going to be a 5.
Yeah.
When it actually hit, it was a 3. But as we all know, it still ripped off the roof of the Superdome.
Yeah.
So I knew going in it was going to be bad. I say all of that to lead to this one point. The day that I'm leaving to fly to Baton Rouge, I remember exactly where I was. I was on 195 going around the Pentagon. And I called Joe Hagan, the Deputy Chief of Staff, to tell him that I'm headed to Andrews, I'm going down, we're doing everything we can. And I said, Joe, but this is going to be a cluster because I can't get stuff coordinated now. And the storm hasn't even hit. And because I had already told them I wanted to leave, I said in an email to Hagan, hey, can I quit now? And of course, everybody picks that up. Oh, look, Brown doesn't care. He wants to quit before the storm even hits.
That's fascinating. I mean, I remember that for
Yeah.
sure.
Oh,
I remember that.
Yeah, and
And you were just being sarcastic.
I'm a sarcastic guy.
Yeah.
I'm a total smartass.
Yeah.
And so I had already agreed to stay through Labor Day. I knew I was walking into a buzzsaw, and I'm telling Hagan, hey, can I quit now? And of course, the New York Times, FOIAs all of my emails. They see the jokes that I crack. Because let me tell you something, Dave, not to get off the subject here.
Go.
But when people are suffering, and people that are the rescue workers, the firefighters, that are taking people off roofs, that are taking them out of flooded homes, they're working their asses off. They're tired, they're worn out, they're stressed out. You know what the best thing to do is? Give them a little humor.
Yeah.
Show a little humanity. It's my father-in-law I told you, delivered me, he was a surgeon. He used to talk about how he would relieve stress in the OR by cracking jokes. And I've always thought that the best way to manage people in a time of stress is to remind them of their humanity. Make them laugh. And if they can laugh for 5 seconds, that gets the endorphins running, and they can go out and keep working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And I was criticized for joking. Well, you know what? Screw them. Because I've been asked before, well, would you take any of those emails back? Not a one of them. Because you know what? that made a staffer smile. That made somebody laugh. And if you don't understand the context within which it was made, then you are deliberately just trying to make hay out of something.